Welcome, where wars become stories. By 1870, Paraguay was like a graveyard. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was terrible. 3 out of every 5 people in Paraguay were gone. Almost 9 out of 10 adult men had died. Fathers, sons, whole family lines were wiped out from the earth. Villages stood empty, farm fields were not being used, and the capital city of Asunción was burned and ruined. What was left was not just a country that had lost a war. It was a nation that was almost destroyed completely. This destruction had not come from a terrible sickness or from a natural disaster. It was the result of war. The War of the Triple Alliance, South America's bloodiest war, had turned one of the continent's proudest people into ashes. And at the center of it all stood a man who believed he was meant for greatness. Francisco Solano López, the man who called himself the Napoleon of South America. How had this happened? How could one leader's dreams destroy his entire nation? Was this truly a desperate fight to survive, or was it the reckless gamble of a single man? To answer that question, we must go back nearly half a century, back to the birth of these nations, built from the crumbling ruins of Spanish and Portuguese empires. Independence had promised freedom, but it brought something else: rivalry, distrust, and the seeds of a war that would one day turn Paraguay into a cemetery. It began not with armies fighting, but with maps, unclear lines drawn across rivers and plains by colonial officials who had left long ago. Borders were uncertain, loyalties were divided, and every new country imagined itself meant to lead. Argentina saw itself as the natural heir to Spain's empire in the Rio de la Plata. Brazil, huge and ambitious, dreamed of spreading its power further south. Uruguay, caught in the middle, was less a free country than a battlefield for its neighbors' ambitions. And Paraguay, landlocked, stubborn, fiercely independent, stood defiant, unwilling to bend to anyone's will. In this world, suspicion ruled. Nations that might have stood together after independence instead circled each other like predators. Rivers, the lifeblood of trade and communication, became weapons. Small fights broke out, alliances shifted, and every decision seemed to sharpen the continent's divisions. Independence had been won, but unity had been lost. And so, South America entered its new age, not with togetherness, but with a question: who would rise and who would be crushed? In that question lay the fate of Paraguay. For when war finally came, it would not simply test armies and borders. It would test the survival of an entire people. And as we shall see time and again, López, the man who believed himself another Napoleon, would choose glory over caution, a decision that would cost his people dearly. The fall of Spain's Rio de la Plata viceroyalty in the 1810s brought forth 3 new nations: Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. To the world, it looked like the triumph of liberty, the fulfillment of revolutions that had swept away European rule. But inside South America, the picture was far darker. Independence had not created unity. It had carved a broken mosaic of states, each convinced of its own destiny, each suspicious of its neighbors. Argentina emerged as the largest and loudest voice of the 3. Buenos Aires, once the jewel of Spain's colonial rule, believed itself the natural leader of the region. Its politicians dreamed of putting the old viceroyalty back together, pulling the lost provinces back into Argentina's control. To them, Uruguay was a buffer state at best, and Paraguay little more than a rebellious province. Paraguay saw things differently. Landlocked but fiercely proud, it had tasted isolation and turned it into a weapon. Surrounded on all sides by stronger rivals, it chose self-reliance, growing crops and building defenses. Independence for Paraguay was not just freedom from Spain. It was freedom from Argentina. Its leaders saw Buenos Aires' ambitions as nothing more than colonialism in new colors. Uruguay, meanwhile, became the battlefield of others' ambitions. A small coastal country, it sat at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, the gateway to the interior. Both Argentina and Brazil wanted it. To Argentina, Montevideo was an extension of Buenos Aires' sphere. To Brazil, Uruguay was a buffer zone, one that must not fall under Argentine control. Uruguay's independence was written into law. But in practice, it was a fragile dream, vulnerable to foreign bayonets. And then there were the borders themselves, or rather the lack of them. Colonial maps had been vague, rivers shifting, lines poorly drawn. Vast stretches of plains, jungle, and swamp lay undefined. Farmers grazed their cattle in lands claimed by multiple governments. Settlers paid taxes to whichever army showed up first. Tensions were not abstract. They touched the land, the water, the livelihoods of ordinary people. Disputes grew sharpest around the rivers. For Paraguay, the Paraná and Paraguay rivers were lifelines, its only escape routes to the outside world. Yet Argentina declared authority over them, taxing goods and restricting passage. Brazil too hungered for control of the waterways to connect its isolated province of Mato Grosso. To Paraguay, these demands were intolerable. To its neighbors, its resistance was insolence. By 1844, Brazil made a bold move. It recognized Paraguay's independence. To Asunción, it was validation. To Buenos Aires, it was provocation. For Argentina, this was the empire in Rio de Janeiro meddling in its backyard, legitimizing a province that should never have been allowed to break away. And so, within 2 decades of independence, the dream of liberty had hardened into rivalry. Argentina eyed dominance. Brazil plotted expansion. Uruguay balanced on a knife's edge, and Paraguay bristled at them all. The new nations of the Rio de la Plata had been born free, but they had not been born united. And soon, their competing ambitions would ignite the fire of war. In South America, rivers were not just waterways. They were lifelines. The continent's interior was vast, rugged, and often impassable. Roads were few, railways almost non-existent. To trade, to travel, to survive, one needed the rivers. Whoever controlled them held the keys to prosperity. And in the Rio de la Plata basin, 3 rivers mattered above all, the Paraná, the Paraguay, and the Uruguay. For Paraguay, those rivers were everything. A landlocked nation surrounded by larger powers had only one path to the outside world, the water. Cotton, tobacco, yerba mate, Paraguay's main exports, all had to flow downstream before they could reach international markets. Without the rivers, the country's economy suffocated. And Buenos Aires knew it. Argentina claimed control over the Paraná, declaring that all goods passing through its stretch must pay tribute. To Paraguay, this was nothing less than economic strangulation, colonial control reborn under a new flag. Every tax was an insult, every restriction a reminder that Argentina still dreamed of control. Brazil, meanwhile, looked westward to Mato Grosso, its distant and isolated province. Reaching it by land meant months of grueling marches across wilderness. The only reliable route was by water up the Paraguay River. But here, Brazil collided with Paraguay, which guarded its stretch of the river like a fortress. Paraguayan patrols stopped Brazilian ships, demanded concessions, or turned them back outright. To Asunción, it was a matter of sovereignty, their river, their rules. To Brazil, it was humiliation. How could a nation of 500,000 dictate terms to an empire of 10 million? Each time a Brazilian vessel was delayed or denied, outrage grew in Rio de Janeiro. The disputes were not only about economics, they were about pride. Rivers were veins of power, and every demand, every denial carried symbolic weight. For Paraguay, refusing to yield proved it was not a pawn. For Argentina and Brazil, every obstruction was a challenge to their authority. Ordinary people felt the tension as well. Ranchers and traders found themselves trapped between governments. Settlers along riverbanks never knew whose flag would appear on the horizon or which taxes they would be forced to pay. Merchants cursed delays. Fishermen watched soldiers patrol the waters. And rumors of war spread like ripples across the current. Maps were redrawn again and again, each capital insisting the rivers belonged to them. But maps meant little in the marshes, where the only law was the rifle on a passing gunboat. The rivers carried trade, wealth, and life. But they also carried envy and resentment. And soon they would carry armies. The stage was set. All it would take was one spark for the waterways of South America to run red. Uruguay was small in size, but vast in significance. Sitting at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, its capital, Montevideo, was the gateway to the continent's interior. Whoever controlled Uruguay controlled access to the Parana and Paraguay rivers, and therefore the lifeblood of trade and war. For Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay was not just a neighbor. It was the prize. Inside Uruguay, politics had split the nation in two. On one side were the Colorados, rooted in Montevideo, supported by merchants, immigrants, and elites who favored ties with Argentina and Brazil. On the other were the Blancos, anchored in the countryside, champions of ranchers and rural landowners, and aligned closely with Paraguay. The divide was more than political. It was cultural, social, almost tribal. Each side saw the other not as opponents, but as traitors. Civil war became a way of life. Bands of armed men roamed the countryside, torching ranches, ambushing convoys, and draping corpses across fences as warnings. Farmers plowed their fields under the gaze of militias. Peasants pledged loyalty not to the nation, but to whichever faction held power in their district. Brazil had already intervened twice in the 1850s, sending troops to support the Colorados. Each time, resentment deepened. And each time, Paraguay watched carefully, knowing Uruguay's alignment would tip the balance of power. For López, a Blanco-led Uruguay was more than an ally. It was a lifeline to the Atlantic. In 1863, the fragile peace broke again. The Colorados rose in rebellion against the ruling Blancos, igniting yet another civil war. Uruguay's soil turned black with smoke as battles flared across its hills and plains. Brazil, weary of a government unfriendly to its interests, had had enough. In 1864, it issued an ultimatum: the Blanco regime must protect Brazilian ranchers and traders, or face invasion. The Blancos, defiant and proud, refused. That October, Brazilian warships bombarded Uruguay's coast, annihilating its tiny navy. Columns of Brazilian soldiers marched across the frontier, pushing rapidly toward Montevideo. The empire expected a quick resolution: the Blancos swept aside, Uruguay secured. But in Asunción, López watched the invasion with growing fury. Uruguay was Paraguay's sole ally, the last friendly government in a sea of hostile giants. If the Blancos fell, Paraguay would be encircled. To López, Brazil's action was not merely aggression. It was a direct challenge to Paraguay's survival. And in that moment, he decided Paraguay would not wait to be surrounded. It would strike first. In October 1864, Brazil acted. Imperial warships descended on Uruguay's coast, their cannons flashing, their shells tearing into the Blanco navy, a pitiful fleet that was reduced to wreckage in hours. On land, Brazilian columns crossed the border, boots splashing through shallow rivers, banners flying. To them, Uruguay was already finished. The empire believed the campaign would be swift: the Blancos would collapse, the Colorados restored, and Brazil's influence secured. It was meant to be a clean operation, a show of strength, nothing more. But Francisco Solano López saw something very different. To him, Brazil's march into Uruguay was not a local intervention. It was a dagger pointed at Paraguay's throat. With Argentina hostile to the west, Brazil hostile to the north, and now Uruguay. About to become a client state of the empire, Paraguay was on the verge of encirclement. López would not wait, he would act. On November 13, 1864, Paraguayan Marines stormed aboard the Brazilian steamer Marquês de Olinda as it neared Asunción. They seized the ship, its crew, and its cargo in broad daylight, a public insult meant for all of South America to see. A month later, on December 13, López formalized the break. Paraguay declared war on Brazil. The gamble was staggering. Paraguay had a population of perhaps 500,000. Brazil had more than 10 million. Paraguay's army numbered 70,000 men, larger than any of its neighbors on paper. But many marched barefoot, carrying rusty muskets, some without boots or proper uniforms. Brazil, by contrast, commanded vast resources, a modern navy, and allies waiting in the wings. Yet López believed he could win. He believed discipline, speed, and sheer will could outweigh numbers. Like Napoleon, whom he so admired, he trusted in audacity. If Paraguay struck fast enough, Brazil would not have time to gather its strength. In Asunción, the declaration was met with thunderous cheers. Paraguayans marched through the streets, shouting for victory, convinced their nation had finally seized its destiny. For a proud people long dismissed as a minor state, it was intoxicating to stand defiant against an empire. But Brazil was only the beginning. López's ambitions, and his rage, were about to pull yet another neighbor into the inferno. López had declared war, and now he had to prove Paraguay's strength. His plan was simple: strike Brazil first, strike hard, and force the empire onto the defensive before it could mobilize its vast resources. The target was the remote province of Mato Grosso, Brazil's frontier territory. In December 1864, Paraguayan columns surged north. Soldiers marched through jungle and swamp, barefoot but determined. They captured isolated garrisons, burned villages, and severed telegraph lines. Brazilian settlers, stunned by the sudden invasion, fled in panic. For a moment, Paraguay seemed unstoppable, a tiny nation humiliating a giant. The victories were celebrated in Asunción as proof of López's genius. Newspapers declared Brazil's empire vulnerable, its armies weak. Ordinary Paraguayans, proud of their soldiers, believed they had struck a blow that would echo across the continent. But the triumph was an illusion. Mato Grosso was vast, sparsely populated, and strategically meaningless. Its loss embarrassed Brazil, but did not cripple it. Worse, the deeper Paraguay's army advanced, the more fragile it became. Supplies ran thin, disease spread, and the jungle devoured men as surely as enemy fire. The greatest obstacle was Brazil's navy. Ironclads and gunboats patrolled the rivers, cutting Paraguay off from reinforcements and blocking the transport of vital supplies. López could march an army, but he could not command the waterways. And without the rivers, every mile of conquest was hollow. Still, López pressed forward. He believed speed was his greatest weapon. If Paraguay struck again, this time southward, it could link with Uruguay's embattled Blancos and open a second front. But to get there, his army needed to cross Corrientes, a province of Argentina. López sent envoys to Buenos Aires requesting passage. He promised Argentina his forces sought only to relieve Uruguay, not to meddle in Argentine affairs. The response was laughter. President Bartolomé Mitre refused outright, unwilling to let a foreign army march across his soil. For López, the rejection was a personal insult. He had asked politely and been mocked. And so, once again, he chose escalation. If Argentina would not grant passage, then Paraguay would take it. With that decision, the fire spread. The war would no longer be Paraguay against Brazil. It would soon engulf the entire Rio de la Plata. To understand the War of the Triple Alliance, you must understand the man at its center. Francisco Solano López was not merely Paraguay's president. He was its architect, its general, its will to fight, and ultimately, its doom. Born in 1827, he was the son of Paraguay's first president, Carlos Antonio López. From childhood, he lived in a world where leadership was his destiny. But it was his journey to Europe that transformed him. In Paris, he marched in parades, studied military science, and observed firsthand the pageantry of Napoleon III court. Yet it was not Napoleon III who captivated him. It was his legendary uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. The tale of a small nation soldier who seized destiny and bent empires to his will became López's guiding star. When López returned to Paraguay, he brought back more than books and uniforms. He brought back an obsession. He began reshaping his country into a fortress. He poured money into forts and foundries, weapons and uniforms. Paraguay's fields, once devoted to commerce, now fed soldiers. By the time he assumed the presidency in 1862, Paraguay, with a population barely 500,000, maintained an army of 70,000, the largest standing force in South America. But numbers were deceptive. Many of his soldiers marched barefoot, lacking boots. Some carried muskets older than themselves. Others drilled with wooden rifles until real ones could be made. Paraguay was disciplined, yes, but also fragile. Its strength was not in its steel. It was in its spirit, and in the iron will of its leader. López styled himself as more than a president. He was commander, visionary, savior. Officers pledged loyalty to him personally, not merely to the nation. He rode at the front of parades in full military regalia, his plumed hat recalling Napoleon himself. To admirers, he was a man destined to lift Paraguay from obscurity and prove it could rival Brazil or Argentina. To enemies, he was reckless, arrogant, and blind to reality. The truth lies somewhere between. López was brilliant in some ways, charismatic, daring, able to rally his people to impossible feats. But he was also consumed by pride. Time and again, he would choose glory over caution. He would gamble not only his army but his nation itself. And as the war widened, his obsession with destiny would drag Paraguay into catastrophe. For López believed history offered him two paths, triumph like Napoleon, or death like Napoleon. He was willing to accept either, so long as he left a legend. But legends are not built from dreams alone. They are built on blood. And soon López would spill it in torrents. In April 1865, López made his boldest move yet. Furious at Argentina's refusal to grant passage, he ordered 20,000 men to cross into the province of Corrientes. The Paraguayan army marched swiftly, drums beating, flags fluttering, bayonets glinting in the sun. Within days, they seized the provincial capital, capturing Argentine warships as they lay helpless in harbor. For Paraguay, it was a moment of triumph. In Asunción, bells rang out and crowds cheered. Newspapers hailed López as the protector of Uruguay and the avenger of South American independence. To his people, this was proof that Paraguay, small and defiant, could humble its larger neighbors. But the truth was far more dangerous. By crossing into Corrientes, López had awakened forces far beyond his control. Argentina, once cautious and divided, now rallied as one. President Bartolomé Mitre declared Paraguay an invader, a threat to sovereignty that must be crushed. In Buenos Aires, volunteers thronged recruitment offices, driven by outrage. Even more devastating, Paraguay's occupation gave Brazil and Argentina a common cause. For decades, the two nations had viewed each other with suspicion, rivals for dominance over the Rio de la Plata. Now López had achieved what no diplomat could, he had united them. And Uruguay, torn by civil war, would not remain neutral either. The Blancos were collapsing, their government faltering. Soon, with Brazilian bayonets propping up the Colorados, Uruguay too would join the alliance against Paraguay. In less than a year, López had transformed Paraguay's situation. What began as a defensive war against Brazil had now become a continental struggle. Instead of isolating the empire, López had isolated himself. Yet López was undeterred. He believed victory lay in audacity. Like his idol Napoleon, he trusted that daring maneuvers and quick strikes could offset impossible odds. If Paraguay struck hard enough, fast enough, perhaps the Triple Alliance would crumble. It was a fantasy. But fantasies die hard, especially when they are carried on the shoulders of an army. And so López marched on, convinced that history was his to seize. What he had truly done, however, was seal Paraguay's fate. On May 1, 1865, in Buenos Aires, 3 delegations sat down to sign what would become one of the most ruthless treaties in South American history. Brazil, Argentina, and the newly installed Colorado regime of Uruguay agreed to form a triple alliance. Their target was not simply the Paraguayan army. It was Francisco Solano López himself, and the nation he ruled. The treaty was explicit. The Allies pledged to fight until López was overthrown. Paraguay would surrender its captured territories. It would pay war debts. It would be stripped of its claims and humbled before its neighbors. This was not a temporary pact of defense. It was a blueprint for the dismantling of Paraguay's power. For López, the news was devastating. His gamble in Corrientes had backfired with breathtaking speed. Instead of isolating Brazil, he had fused its interests with Argentina's. Instead of saving Uruguay's blancos, he had lost them entirely. Paraguay was now alone, outnumbered 20-1 in population, with no allies left. And yet, he did not retreat. He did not sue for peace. He doubled down. Across Paraguay, church bells rang as mobilization orders spread. Every able-bodied man was called to arms. Women were tasked with weaving uniforms, carrying supplies, and tending the wounded. Children drilled with wooden rifles in preparation for the day they would be handed real ones. The nation itself became a barracks. López framed the war as a struggle for survival. He declared that Paraguay fought not just against armies, but against enslavement, against annihilation. Patria o muerte, the homeland or death, became the rallying cry. And the people believed him. They poured into the ranks, singing hymns and patriotic songs, convinced their courage could defy the combined might of three empires. For them, this was no longer López's war. It was Paraguay's war. But courage could not erase disparity. The Allies commanded modern navies, vast resources, and endless reserves of manpower. Paraguay had zeal, but little else. Still, López pressed forward. He believed that by striking swiftly, he could fracture the alliance before it crushed him. If he could defeat Brazil at sea, Argentina on land, and hold Uruguay in turmoil, perhaps destiny would yet be his. And so, with rivers blockaded and armies on the move, the war now shifted to its first great trial, the battle for control of the waters. The largest naval clash in South American history was about to begin. June 11, 1865. The rivers of South America awoke to thunder. At the town of Riachuelo on the Paraná River, Paraguay launched its boldest gamble yet. López ordered Admiral Pedro Ignacio Meza to strike the Brazilian fleet at anchor, to wreck the empire's navy in a single daring blow. The plan was audacious. Paraguayan ships would approach silently at dawn, board the Brazilian vessels, and slaughter their crews before they could react. Surprise, López believed, would deliver a miracle. But discipline faltered. As the Paraguayan squadron drew near, Admiral Meza lost his nerve. Instead of waiting to ram and board, he opened fire too soon. Cannon smoke betrayed their approach. The Brazilians, startled, rushed back aboard their ships. Chaos gave way to order, and order gave way to retaliation. Among them was Admiral Francisco Manuel Barroso, commanding the paddle steamer Amazonas. Faced with disaster, he made a desperate choice: he would ram the enemy head-on. With engines roaring, the Amazonas plowed into Paraguayan ships. Smashing holes, overturning barges, and scattering crews into the water. The river turned red as sailors drowned or were cut down in the crossfire. For hours, the battle raged, thick fog cloaking the river, cannon fire booming blindly across the water. At moments, it seemed Paraguay might prevail, their lighter craft darting between the lumbering Brazilian ironclads. But when Admiral Meza was struck in the chest and fell mortally wounded, the heart of the Paraguayan navy collapsed with him. His fleet broke, retreating in disorder under relentless fire. By midday, the river belonged to Brazil. Paraguay had lost its navy, destroyed in a single morning. The implications were catastrophic. With control of the waterways, Brazil could supply its armies with ease, blockade Paraguayan ports, and cut off López's lifeline to the outside world. In Asunción, the defeat was a shock. López had promised victory, had proclaimed himself the protector of the rivers. Now his fleet lay shattered. The people still sang his praises, still trusted his leadership, but doubt had begun to creep in. And for Paraguay's army, it meant fighting alone, without the hope of naval support. Every supply line, every reinforcement, every retreat would now be shadowed by Brazilian ships. Riachuelo was more than a battle lost. It was a turning point. Paraguay would never again command the rivers. And without the rivers, victory became nearly impossible. Yet López refused to see it that way. To him, this was not defeat. It was only a setback. Like Napoleon after Russia, he convinced himself that with one more daring stroke, destiny could still be his. And so he looked once more toward Uruguay. To keep the war alive, he would march again. Even after the disaster at Riachuelo, López clung to his dream of reaching Uruguay. If Paraguay could still rescue the Blancos, perhaps the war could be turned. The quickest route lay through the Parana and Uruguay rivers. But now those waters were under Brazil's watchful control. To march by land meant hardship. To march by river meant suicide. Still, López ordered the attempt. In late 1865, 3,000 Paraguayan soldiers pressed southward, aiming to cross the Uruguay River. They were ragged but determined, many barefoot, uniforms patched and torn, rifles rusty from constant use. Their mission: link up with Blanco forces before Brazil and Argentina closed the noose. At Humaitá, they met their fate. 9,000 Allied troops, Brazilians, Argentines, and Colorado-aligned Uruguayans, barred the crossing. The Paraguayans were outnumbered 3-1, but they charged with a ferocity that stunned even their enemies. Cavalry swept down with lances leveled, scattering Argentine infantry. For a moment, victory seemed possible. But the weight of numbers told. Allied artillery belched fire, tearing holes in the Paraguayan ranks. Infantry squares bristled with bayonets, repelling every cavalry charge. The riverbank became a killing field, men falling into the water, thrashing before sinking beneath the current. By the end, it was not a battle. It was an annihilation. The entire Paraguayan force was either killed or captured. 3,000 men, gone. An irreplaceable loss for a country of only 500,000. In Paraguay, the news landed like a hammer. Families wept for fathers and sons who would never return. Women whispered of a war that devoured every household. Still, López insisted the sacrifices were necessary, that Paraguay stood on the edge of greatness. But the truth was unavoidable. Each campaign bled Paraguay further. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition ran low. And disease crept through the camps. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, marched on empty stomachs, and carried wounded comrades on makeshift litters. The army still obeyed, still fought, but its strength was ebbing away. And yet, their bravery could not be denied. At Humaitá, though doomed, Paraguay's soldiers had shown a willingness to die rather than yield. It was a quality that would mark the rest of the war, heroism in the face of hopeless odds. But heroism was not enough. López's dream of saving Uruguay was dead. The Blancos had fallen. The Colorados, triumphant, stood under Brazil's wing. The Triple Alliance was complete. And now its armies turned north, ready to bring the war into Paraguay itself. May 24, 1866. The marshes of Tuyuti, near the Parana River, would soon become a slaughterhouse. López, frustrated by Paraguay's setbacks, believed only a grand offensive could break the stalemate. He gathered 27,000 men, the largest army his nation would ever put in the field, and ordered them to strike the Allied camp at Tuyuti. If he could smash Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in one blow, perhaps the alliance would unravel. The Paraguayans marched at dawn, bayonets fixed, cavalry lances gleaming. Drums beat, horns sounded. The attack was meant to overwhelm through shock and fury. At first, it worked. The Allied defenders were caught off guard, scrambling from their tents. Paraguayan columns swept through brush and swamp, screaming war cries. Cavalry broke into gallops, crashing against infantry lines. For a moment, panic rippled through the Allied camp. But then the defenses stiffened. Argentine and Brazilian artillery roared, belching smoke and iron into the advancing masses. Grapeshot shredded entire ranks in seconds. Infantry formed squares, bristling with bayonets that impaled charging cavalrymen. The marshland slowed the Paraguayan advance, breaking the assault into waves instead of one unstoppable tide. Still they came. Hour after hour, Paraguayan soldiers hurled themselves against the Allied lines. They climbed over the bodies of their comrades, fired volleys with dwindling ammunition, and charged with bayonets when powder ran out. The courage was undeniable. The cost was unbearable. By nightfall, 13,000 Paraguayans lay dead or dying. Nearly half the attacking force had been annihilated. For Paraguay, a nation of 500,000, it was not just a defeat. It was a wound from which the army would never recover. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Entire villages lost all their sons in a single day. The Allies counted around 3,000 dead, heavy losses, yes, but survivable for nations with millions to draw upon. For Paraguay, each casualty was irreplaceable. A generation of men had been sacrificed on the swampy plains of Tuyuti. And yet, López proclaimed victory. He told his people that Paraguay had struck terror into the hearts of its enemies, that the homeland's spirit remained unbroken. In truth, Tuyuti was the beginning of the end. Paraguay had shown courage, but courage could not balance scales so cruelly weighted. The self-styled Napoleon of South America had gambled everything on one battle, and lost. From here on, the war would turn into a slow bleed. Disease, attrition, and despair would gnaw at Paraguay's armies. But López refused to stop. Time and again, he would choose glory over caution. And his people would pay the price. After the horror of Tuyuti, both armies reeled. The Allies had survived, but barely. Paraguay had bled itself white, yet still refused to break. The battlefield fell silent, save for the groans of the dying and the buzz of flies circling the dead. What followed was not swift maneuver, but suffocating stalemate. Along the borderlands, trenches scarred the earth, crude ditches filled with mud and disease. Soldiers lived knee-deep in filth, swatting mosquitoes, drinking foul water. Dysentery, cholera, and fever became as deadly as cannon fire. Corpses were buried shallow, their stench lingering in the air, a grim reminder of what awaited the living. For the Allies, misery spread quickly. Brazil conscripted slaves from its plantations, marching them into battlefields where death awaited. Argentina called up provincial levies, peasants barely trained before being thrust into the mud. Uruguay, exhausted by its own civil wars, struggled to keep even token forces in the field. Men deserted, morale collapsed, and commanders squabbled over strategy. Paraguay fared no better. López scraped the bottom of his nation's reserves. Boys barely into their teens were pressed into service, drilling with rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Old men, gray-bearded and frail, marched once more to war. Women carried the burden of the homeland, tending crops, sewing uniforms, nursing the wounded. Entire families were consumed by the war machine. In this grim deadlock, López tried words instead of bullets. He sent envoys to Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre, proposing negotiations. Perhaps, López thought, the Allies, shaken by losses and disease, would accept compromise. He would yield some territory, perhaps even ships, if Paraguay's sovereignty could be preserved. But Mitre was unmoved. He demanded unconditional surrender. López must fall. Paraguay must submit. No half measures. To Mitre, the war was not about peace, but about destroying Paraguay's capacity to rise again. For López, it was humiliation, but also revelation. The Allies would never treat him as an equal. They did not seek negotiation. They sought annihilation. So he turned back to defiance. If Paraguay could not secure peace, then it would fight to the last breath. López told his soldiers they must resist, no matter the cost. He told his people the homeland was sacred, that survival was glory enough. And thus the war dragged on. Trenches rotting. Soldiers wasting away. Hope withering. Yet López's pride remained unbroken. If diplomacy had failed, perhaps one more battle could tip the scales. And so, in September 1866, he ordered his men to stand at Curupayty, a stronghold by the river, where the Allies would soon march straight into disaster. September 22, 1866. The Allies, eager to break the stalemate, turned their sights on the Paraguayan fortress of Curupayty, a bastion guarding the river approaches northward. Their plan was confident, almost arrogant. A thunderous naval bombardment would reduce the Paraguayan defenses to rubble, after which tens of thousands of infantry would march forward to finish the job. Victory seemed assured. At dawn, Brazilian ironclads opened fire. For hours, the river thundered with cannon blasts, shells arcing through the air, explosions tearing up mud and timber. Allied commanders congratulated themselves, believing the Paraguayan line shattered. Drums beat, bugles sounded. The infantry advanced. Then came the shock. As Allied soldiers slogged through swampy ground, the Paraguayan guns erupted. Hidden artillery positions, untouched by the bombardment, opened fire at point-blank range. Grapeshot shredded advancing columns. Men fell by the hundreds, tumbling into the mud, drowning in pools of water turned red with blood. Officers shouted for order, but chaos reigned. Still, the Allies pushed on. Waves of Brazilian and Argentine troops stumbled forward, only to be cut down again. The marsh slowed their march, packed them into clusters, and made them easy prey for the defenders. The Paraguayan trenches, cleverly designed, funneled attackers into killing zones. What was meant to be a swift victory became wholesale slaughter. By nightfall, the field was a charnel house. Nearly 4,000 Allied soldiers lay dead or dying. Paraguay had lost fewer than 100. It was one of the most lopsided defeats in South American history. Survivors staggered back to camp in shock, their uniforms torn and bloodied, their faith in victory shattered. In Asunción, bells rang and crowds wept with joy. For once, Paraguay had not only resisted, but triumphed. López proclaimed Curupayty as proof that destiny still favored his nation. He called it divine justice, the homeland vindicated by heaven itself. For a brief moment, morale soared. Yet the triumph was hollow. The Allies had suffered a humiliation, but they would recover. Brazil, with its vast resources, could replace every man lost. Argentina and Uruguay, though shaken, would not abandon the alliance. Paraguay, by contrast, had won a battle it could not afford. Its people were starving, its fields barren, its armies stretched to the breaking point. Curupayty gave López hope. But it was a hope built on sand. The victory had delayed the inevitable, not prevented it. And soon the Allies would return, with new leadership, renewed strength, and a plan to grind Paraguay into dust. For the next phase of the war would center on one place, a fortress so mighty it was called the Gibraltar of South America, Humaitá. After Curupayty, the Allies faltered, their morale shattered, their commanders discredited, disease rotting their camps. Many wondered if the war could even be won. But Brazil had one advantage Paraguay could never match: endless resources. And in late 1866, it found the commander who could turn those resources into victory, Marshal Luis Alves de Lima y Silva, the Duke of Caxias. Caxias was no firebrand like López. He was a patient strategist, a builder, a reformer. Where others rushed, he prepared. Where others squandered men, he saved them. His mission was clear: strangle Paraguay slowly and completely. And at the center of his plan lay one target, the fortress of Humaitá. Humaitá was Paraguay's pride, its shield, its Gibraltar. Perched on the banks of the Paraguay River, it bristled with cannons and earthworks. A massive chain stretched across the water, blocking any naval approach. For years, Paraguayans had boasted it was impregnable, that no enemy would ever pass its guns. As long as Humaitá held, Asunción was safe. Caxias refused to be intimidated. He began the siege with patience bordering on cruelty. For 8 long months, he drilled his men, rebuilt supply lines, and improved sanitation to blunt the killing hand of disease. Engineers hacked roads through swamps, dug trenches inch by inch, and laid the groundwork for encirclement. Bit by bit, the noose tightened. In August 1867, the Allies launched assaults, but Paraguayan defenders fought fiercely, their cannons tearing bloody holes in the attackers. For a moment, it seemed López's boast might be true. Yet Caxias did not relent. He shifted his focus to the river. February 1868 brought the decisive stroke. Under a storm of Paraguayan fire, Brazilian ironclads dashed forward, smashing through the chain barrier in a daring gamble. Shells splashed the river. Crews fell screaming. Decks ran with blood. But the ships broke through. For the first time, the mighty fortress was flanked. The defenders fought on for months. But the outcome was sealed. Surrounded by land, bypassed by river, starved of supplies, Humaitá's garrison withered. In July, after desperate breakout attempts failed, the survivors surrendered. The fall of Humaitá was a catastrophe for Paraguay. Its greatest fortress, its national symbol, was gone. The rivers lay open, and with them the path to Asunción. López, once confident, now fled deeper north, abandoning his proud bastion to ruin. For Paraguay's people, the news was crushing. Humaitá had been more than a fortress. It was hope itself. Now even hope was gone. But López still refused to yield. Like Napoleon retreating from Moscow, he told his soldiers the fight was not lost, that destiny still awaited them. Yet with Humaitá in ruins, the road to Paraguay's capital lay bare. And the Allies were marching down it. With Humaitá fallen, the road to Paraguay's capital lay open. Yet López had not given up. He ordered his men to dig new lines of defense along the Piquisiri River, constructing trenches and earthworks, hoping to stall the Allied advance. He swore that Paraguay would fight inch by inch, turning every hill and swamp into a fortress. But the Duke of Caxias was too clever to charge headlong. He studied the defenses and saw what López could not admit: Paraguay's army was exhausted, starving, and brittle. A frontal assault would be costly, but unnecessary. Instead, Caxias conceived a plan as bold as it was secret. He ordered engineers to carve a road through the jungle, more than 10 kilometers of dense, tangled wilderness that López believed impassable. For weeks, thousands of Allied troops hacked paths with machetes, dragging cannons through mud, building bridges across streams. All the while, Paraguayan sentries sat behind their fortifications, waiting for an attack that never came. Then, in December 1868, the trap was sprung. The Allies burst out of the jungle behind López's lines. The Paraguayan defenses, bypassed, collapsed in confusion. What followed was a campaign of running battles known as the Piquisiri Campaign, a relentless series of clashes that ground down Paraguay's remaining strength. The climax came at Lomas Valentinas, where López himself directed his dwindling forces. His soldiers were half-starved, many barefoot, some armed with pikes instead of rifles. Still, they fought with desperate courage. Waves of Paraguayan troops hurled themselves at the invaders, only to be torn apart by superior firepower. By the battle's end, Paraguay's last organized army was destroyed. López narrowly escaped, carried away by a desperate cavalry charge that cut through enemy lines. His generals were captured, his staff scattered, his army shattered beyond repair. On January 1, 1869, the Allies marched into Asunción. But what they found was no triumphal prize. The city was nearly deserted, its people fled into the countryside. Houses were looted, churches stripped, neighborhoods burned. For three nations that had fought so long, the capital offered little more than ashes. Still, the symbolism was immense. Paraguay's heart had fallen. The Allies occupied its seat of power, its government in exile, its armies destroyed. For any rational leader, this was the end. But López was no ordinary leader. He vanished into the interior, vowing to fight on, even if it meant dragging Paraguay into the grave with him. And so began the war's final, most desperate phase, when an entire people would be forced into the flames of guerrilla war. By 1869, Paraguay was broken in every way that mattered. Its capital lay in ruins, its army shattered, its people starving. Any other leader might have sued for peace, begged for mercy, sought to salvage what remained. But Francisco Solano López was not any other leader. To him, surrender meant dishonor. To him, defeat meant betrayal. If Paraguay was to fall, it would fall fighting. And so the war entered its final, most desperate chapter. López retreated into the countryside, rallying whatever fragments of resistance he could. But these were no longer armies in the traditional sense. They were boys barely in their teens, their uniforms hanging off thin shoulders. Old men, stooped with age, gripping muskets with trembling hands. Women carrying supplies, patching uniforms, even taking up arms themselves. Paraguay had become a nation at war in the most literal sense, every family a garrison, every home a redoubt. To keep the enemy from gaining anything of value, López unleashed a scorched earth policy. Villages were burned before the Allies could seize them. Fields of crops were torched, leaving nothing but blackened husks. Entire communities vanished into smoke. The people, once proud farmers and herdsmen, were forced into the jungle, surviving on roots, bark, and scraps. Desertion grew, but López answered with terror. He ordered deserters shot on the spot. Even civilians suspected of wavering loyalty were executed. Fear kept many in line, but it also deepened the sense that Paraguay was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival against its own fate. The Allies pursued, but the jungle swallowed them. Campaigns dragged on for months, soldiers sick with fever, convoys harried by ambushes. Guerrilla bands struck from the shadows, vanishing into the trees before retaliation could come. Brazilian, Argentine, and Uruguayan soldiers cursed the land itself, which seemed to conspire against them. Yet the noose continued to tighten. Each battle whittled Paraguay's numbers further. Each march left more dead along the roadside. López's grand army of 70,000 had dwindled to a few thousand starving souls. Still, he would not yield. To his men, he declared, better to die with honor than live as slaves. To his enemies, he promised endless resistance. To history, he wanted to leave a legend, that Paraguay had fought to the very last. But legends are written in blood. And as López pushed deeper into the wilderness, his nation bled with him. The war's final act would come in a remote valley called Cerro Corá, where Paraguay's fate and López's life would meet their end. March 1, 1870. In the remote valley of Cerro Corá, beside a winding river, Francisco Solano López prepared to meet his fate. His army was no longer an army at all, just 400 gaunt survivors, half-starved, many barefoot, some armed with little more than pikes and machetes. Facing them was a Brazilian force of 4,000 veterans, hardened by years of war. The clash was brief, brutal, and hopeless. The Paraguayan defenders fought with desperate fury, but they were overwhelmed, cut down in the mud and underbrush. López himself, wounded and surrounded, refused every offer of clemency. A Brazilian cavalryman's lance pierced his side. A bullet followed soon after. Even as he collapsed, López shouted his final words, "Muero con mi patria, I die with my nation." Moments later, the man who had led Paraguay into the abyss was dead. The war was over. But the cost defied comprehension. Paraguay had lost between 60 and 70% of its population. Nearly 9 out of 10 adult men were gone. Entire families erased. Entire villages depopulated. What had once been a proud, defiant nation was reduced to ashes. Women and children shouldered the burden of rebuilding, while fields lay empty and cities stood in ruins. For Paraguay, recovery would take generations. And in truth, it never fully came. The Allies emerged victorious, but scarred. Brazil cemented its place as the dominant power of South America, yet paid a staggering price in lives and treasure. Argentina gained territory, but was left with crushing war debts. Uruguay secured its survival, but only as a buffer between giants. None walked away unscathed. And what of López? To some, he was a tyrant who gambled recklessly with his people's lives, dragging them into a war they could never win. To others, he became a martyr, the embodiment of defiance against impossible odds, a leader who chose death over surrender. In Paraguay, his name is still spoken with both bitterness and reverence. The ruins of Humaitá, the empty villages, the mass graves, they are reminders of the price of ambition, rivalry, and pride. And yet, the war's shadow lingers. It reshaped borders, hardened national identities, and left Paraguay forever cautious, forever wary, surrounded by stronger neighbors. It showed the world that South America's destiny would not be forged by colonial powers alone, but by its own people, in struggles as devastating as any fought in Europe. The War of the Triple Alliance remains the bloodiest conflict in Latin American history, a tragedy born of ambition, waged in rivers and jungles, fought to the last gasp of a nation. Its lesson endures, that glory pursued at all costs can consume even the proudest of peoples, leaving only ruins behind.